I have a very booming voice, so if no one can hear me, I'd be surprised, but just give me a little bit of wave if I'm not loud enough. My name is Abby Hook. I'm up from Seattle with my colleague Michelle Weinstein, who's also here. We do quite a bit of open standards facilitation, and I said this in November too. I apologize if I slip into you all. I got a wide giggle last time I dropped my first Americanism. I'm trying to avoid it, but it's virtually impossible. So can I just get a show of hands? Who was there in November and got a brief open standards sort of orientation? Okay, so quite a few of you. We're going to use some of the same slides. The more you see it, the more sense it makes, but I'll try not to belabor the same points too many times. So today, as Margaret said, we're going to go over some of the progress that we've made since November with the help of the work that you did last fall. And we're going to start talking about the next phase, which is developing an idea of what the pressures are in the Coquitlam watershed. Here is the basic open standards 5-step process. This is a standard adaptive management cycle of plan, do, check, and adapt. The open standards was developed. It's used worldwide for everything from small villages in Africa thinking about local farming and their values associated with their environment to West Coast-wide North America salmon recovery efforts. This has been tested throughout many different planning efforts, and one of the things that was added immediately was this capture and share learning. So there's actually an open standards database that's maintained throughout the world so that people using this framework can share what they've learned and improve upon their planning processes. So today we're going to concentrate, and in this first phase of the watershed plan, we'll be concentrating on the conceptualizing. Go with this in a minute. Oh, gosh, I'm sorry. And what makes open standards different from a traditional planning process? The first thing is, and we went over this in November, but it allows for the inclusion of both natural, ecological goals and also human well-being goals. Often when you do watershed plans, you're concentrating only on conservation of the natural environment, which doesn't really account for all the things that people need in these watersheds in order to live well and comfortably. And it doesn't account for the trade-offs that often exist between our human systems and natural systems. The other thing that open standards does is it sets up a framework that really allows you to place your strategies in context of your watershed and link from what you put your money and your time and your resource towards to what you expect to happen as a result. Because it builds an evaluation framework from the beginning, it asks you to develop indicators that you would expect to see along the way as you implement your strategies, all the way through what you expect to happen to the pressures that are currently threatening some of your ecological and human well-being goals, to your status metrics. So what do you see changing over the long term in your watershed? It allows you to synthesize all different types of information. As you go out tonight, you're going to see that some of the information is qualitative, some is based on the sense of what people have in the watershed, and some is based on hard numbers that are associated with flow gauges, fisheries numbers, etc. So again, it tries to take all different sorts of information, natural, human, qualitative, quantitative, and start to look across the gamut of everything we know to make very informed decisions. And finally, it's intended to be iterative. You just saw the plan, do, check, and adapt, adaptive management cycle. And what the open standards encourages you to do is, if you don't have perfect information, to put placeholders in, so that as that information is developed, or as you sort of refine your understanding of the watershed, you can update this. You don't have to have perfect information in order to make some decisions about where you would like to put your time and money towards your priority strategies. So again, the phase one between last fall and this coming September is on this conceptualize step. Define initial team, define scope, vision, components, identify and prioritize pressures, and complete conceptual models. So what does that mean in plain planning speak? This is a little bit just more friendly language than some of the technical open standards language. What do we care about and think is critical? This was the question that was put before the roundtable in November of 2012. What is the project area, the time frame of the project, and the players? How healthy are the things that we care about and we think are critical in the watershed? What is threatening those things? What pressures are the worst? And finally, what are the contributing factors to our current situation? How do you describe the context of why pressures continue to exist in the Coquitlam watershed? By November of 2012, there had been years of effort through this roundtable process to define the project area, the players, and the time frame of the project. In November, we started with gathering information on what the 80 or so participants in the roundtable felt were the most critical things in the watershed. And between November and now, the task group and core committee have been working on how you describe the health of the things that were identified as critical. Today, we're going to start to gather some information on what's threatening the different components that were identified. And as we move towards the summer, we're going to start thinking about how you rank those pressures, which again will eventually inform where you start with your strategies. I don't have a check mark there, but by September we'll have some basic information on how to describe the context by which your strategies can be placed in your watershed. So we've described these different planning steps, and graphically this is what it looks like when you bring it all together. So this is not the Coquitlam. This is a hypothetical watershed. It's actually a watershed in Puget Sound that I've worked in. And if you look at the schematic, what you see is the project area is defined by watershed X. The green ovals are what we call the ecological components. So that's what this watershed said were the most important or the most critical things to concentrate on recovering, restoring, protecting in the watershed. And the brown oval is a human well-being target, so something that humans really valued that the natural environment provided for them in watershed X. If you remember back to November, one of the things that we talked about was how to link our natural system to what humans find important in the watershed through ecosystem services. So when we think about a watershed plan, we ask the question, what is it that humans value that the watershed provides? This is a very simple example where you can say that salmon harvest is clearly dependent on salmon being in good condition in the watershed. Dikes are a common pressure in many large river systems. And in this case, you can see that dikes were identified as a pressure that affect main stem, side channels, and freshland wetlands. And then we ask the question, why do damaging dikes persist on the landscape? And that's what we call the contributing factors. So these are the root causes for why we have dikes that are causing harm to the main stem, side channels, and freshwater wetlands in watershed X. And the way that this reads is, why are dikes a pressure? They're a pressure because there's high demand for them. Why is there high demand for them? Because we have development in flood areas. Why do we have development in flood areas? Perhaps it's because there's a lot of pressure from population growth, or perhaps regulations aren't strong enough to prohibit development. Again, I'm not talking about the Coquitlam, but these are just some of the root causes for why we would put development in flood-prone areas. What Open Standards does is try to establish this evaluation from the get-go. So often what we have in traditional planning processes is we identify some problems and we do strategies, and at the very end, almost often as an add-on, we add a monitoring chapter. But this forces you from the beginning to think about how you describe the things that you care about or the pressures that you would like to abate. So you're building your evaluation network from the beginning, which establishes some really strong performance metrics for as you start to implement your strategies. You can do exactly the same thing for your human well-being components. So in this case, the Hood Canals on the west side of Puget Sound. They've identified commercial shell fishing, agriculture, livable communities, cultural heritage, and recreation as all things that the people who live and work in Hood Canal care about. Oh, we did it again. Sorry, guys. And looking directly at commercial shell fishing, one of the pressures that's been identified is inadequate, and I'm going to concentrate on infrastructure for this example. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem as you look back, as you track kind of upstream of your pressure. It's a problem because there isn't the seed and larval production to support commercial shell fishing. Well, why is seed and larval production insufficient? Hood Canal identified that the permitting process was extremely burdensome and that there were inconsistent regulations across jurisdictions and agencies. So in this case, you couldn't move product from one area to another easily to support the commercial shell fishing industry. Those are the contributing factors. And once again, indicators, whether you're talking about natural components or human well-being components, are established to try to put all of these things on the same playing field. So eventually you can link your actions or your strategies to the overall impact that you would expect over time. So moving into what we call phase 2 of this watershed plan, step 2 of the open standards is how do you plan those actions? What are the ultimate goals? The ultimate goal might be to improve your sockeye population. How do you do that? What change would you like to see? In this case, a strategy might be rain gardens to abate stormwater. Well, what are you going to measure to know if you're actually having an effect? And in this case, just tracking through this example, you might look at your hydrograph as it relates to your precipitation to see if your overall rain garden strategy was having an effect on flow. What should you be measuring? What should you be reporting on, and how and to who? And who's responsible for implementing your strategies? So again, going back to this conceptual model, one of the powerful things about a conceptual model is it puts your strategies in context. So it allows you to actually look at what root causes you expect your strategy to affect. It's a really nice way. This looks very full. You can account for your current strategies in your watershed. And you can also do a gaps analysis for where you think there are root causes that you might need to create new strategies because of problems that aren't being dealt with. So if you focus on the top, I'm going to call it a string, from dikes to dikes not modified or set back to lack of funding. So that again reads, dikes are a problem because they're not being modified or set back. Why are they not being modified or set back? Well, there's insufficient funding for setbacks, and the strategy would be to increase incentives for dike setbacks, or for funding rather, excuse me. So if you think about that chain, what we can do is turn that into a theory of change or a logic statement. So this is how you test to see if your strategies are actually going to have the effect that you would expect. This is called a results chain, and it's what we expect to see along the way, and it provides measurements along the way so that you know if you're not getting the effect that you expected. And this is how this reads. If you increase incentives for funding, then funding for setbacks is secured. If funding for setbacks is secured, then dikes will be set back. If they are set back, then they will have a reduced impact on main stem side channels and freshwater wetlands. You establish metrics along the way so that you know if something in your theory of change breaks down. An example from the Puget Sound might be, funding for setbacks is secured, but dikes are not set back. So you would go to see, well, why is that happening? And in the Puget Sound, at least, there are policies to support agriculture that even if you purchase land and have money to set back, the land use policy doesn't support that change. So that might call for another strategy to help you figure out how to achieve your ultimate outcome. If dikes are set back but they do not have a reduced impact, and you know that from the different indicators that you've already built along the way, you might ask yourself, well, is it because new dikes are being built? Is the overall length of these things staying the same because as fast as we can set them back, people are putting new bank hardening in? And then you might be looking at a protective strategy. But again, it allows you to really look at where this logic might break down and where you might need to stop and adapt in order to be more effective for your ultimate outcome, your ultimate goal. So how do we define healthy? And this is what we're going to talk about and what you're going to see today. In November, we started by identifying some components, and Krista is going to review how that exercise was done. Since November, we've started to think about how to describe those components. So how we do this in open standards is we develop attributes, and the attributes of components are the things that if they're missing or altered, the whole integrity of the component is off. So they're kind of the building blocks for what you would expect your component to depend on. And once those attributes are identified, we actually do indicators. Indicators can be qualitative or quantitative, but they are an actual measurement that allows you to give information about the attribute. And the goal is the desired future condition of the component. So that's where you're hoping to get eventually. For salmon, an easy example is the attributes for salmon are often abundance, diversity, and productivity. And then the indicators, and these are not complete. I had fishery managers come up to me afterwards and say, those indicators are lousy after the last presentation. These are just examples. Usually there are 3 to 5 indicators that represent a suite of what you'd want to look at for each attribute. But for abundance, you might want to look at the number of spawners. You might want to look at the number of outmigrants. There's a number of things that would tell you about the size of your population. And then the goal might be, by 2040, the salmon population is healthy. Or I've also heard by 2040, the salmon population is harvestable. So the logic is, components represent your ecosystem, attributes represent the components, and indicators represent the attributes, with the idea that if your indicators are okay, then your attributes are okay. And if your attributes are okay, then your components are healthy, and you're able to achieve your vision. So what does healthy mean? This is the tricky part, and this is where the task group did a tremendous amount of work over the last 5 or so months to meet some of these definitions. For ecological components, we put healthy within the context of acceptable range of natural variation. This is very pie in the sky because often we don't have an idea of what natural variation for some of these things is. But we do our best for the information that we have. Very good is often looked at as historic values. Good is within natural range of variation but requires some intervention. Fair is outside the range of natural variation and definitely requires human intervention. And poor is restoration is becoming increasingly difficult and could result in extinction or extirpation. These bins are used so that you can talk about these things in common language, so that you're not dependent on status numbers. Because again, you're trying to put things on the same page so that you can look across your components and know sort of at a very gross level what's in good condition, what's in poor condition, and that helps you think about where you might want to put your strategies first. So this is what the overall roll-up look, or the overall sort of presentation of health looks like for salmon. If your indicator is number of spawners, you would have your basin-specific information on what your carrying capacity for abundance was, with some sort of desired future condition. It might be very good if you've got a pristine watershed. It might be good if you think you can only get to a certain level because of the base constraints that you have. Human well-being components are slightly different because we don't have natural ranges of variation for the things that we value related to the human system. So instead, we depend on the community goal statements. Very good is that you're in the condition that you'd like to be in with no need for intervention. You're stable. Good is that you're in the goal condition, but there's intervention required to keep it stable. Fair is that you're trending in the wrong direction, and poor is that you're not meeting goal condition, and it requires significant intervention to improve the condition. So again, here's an example from the recreation component. The indicator is public accessibility to the river and tributaries. And you can see that the current level, the watershed group felt did not meet the goal of the watershed. So plans underway to improve access, greater access including handicap access, is where the watershed would like to be in the future. So again, this is dependent on the goal statement, and as you tour these stations tonight, I think it's really important to look at the goal because this is what these health ratings are based on. And then as a communication tool, again, these condition bins can feel a little clunky, but the overall goal is to be able to roll up across your components to talk about the overall condition of what you care about. Again, it's so that you can message to your watershed, so that you can think about where you want to put your strategies first. This is an example, again, from the Puget Sound. They just looked at ecological components, and you can see the roll-ups are on the far right. Where you have white boxes with dashes, that's because there wasn't data available for those. They're indicators that are placeholders there, but they actually weren't considered because there was data that wasn't sufficient. And you'll see a little bit of that tonight too. Placeholders that on future cranks of that adaptive management wheel, in the iterative nature of this cycle, you might actually be able to fill and give you new information. So I'm going to hand it over to Krista to go over what we've all been up to since November, and you'll hear from me a little bit later.
Thanks so much, Abby. And we'll have time for some questions afterwards. So if you've got some questions about the open standards process, then Abby will be available to answer those in about 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just bring you up to speed on the work that we've been doing since November. So as Abby mentioned, we'd done a lot of work already to define our project team, the vision for the watershed, which was work that the Roundtable had done in those years leading up to the initiation of this watershed plan. We've defined the scope of the plan from the dam at Coquitlam Lake down to the mouth of the river, that approximately 18-kilometer stretch of river. And so what we've been doing since November is trying to define these components that will basically provide the framework for our watershed plan. We kicked this off at the Roundtable meeting last November. And if you'll recall, Craig Orr gave us a really great presentation on ecosystem services to introduce us to that concept that we get things from the trees, the salmon, the river, the water. We get these ecological services that provide us with recreational opportunities, clean air, clean drinking water. And we tried to tease those things out at the meeting. And what we did was ask people to think about, as a starting point, what would be some good suggestions for ecological components. Those were supposed to be things that define what we care about in our watershed, what we want to protect, what we want to restore, things that are important to achieve our vision, which is a healthy watershed that's supported and enjoyed by the community. So we gave everyone 2 cards and asked them to brainstorm 2 ecological components. And then we asked them to think about the human well-being side as well, and think about ecosystem services and what values we get from maintaining things like rivers and forests and salmon, ecological components of our watershed. And again, got 2 suggestions from people. In total, we ended up with 211 cards representing input from about 53 people. And through an iterative process, we tried to group the feedback and try to come up with a system that would work well for our watershed plan. And we boiled it down to 4 ecological components and 6 human well-being components. And I'll give you a quick overview of what those are. So starting on the ecological side, so this is a bit of a word cloud. So these are very abbreviated versions of the feedback that we got on the cards. And the size of the word reflects how many times that word or that component was suggested. So as you can see, water or flow came up a lot, as well as with qualifiers such as clean, quantity, quality, hydrological function. And so what we did was grouped all of those concepts together into a component that we're calling rivers and tributaries. And then some of those concepts like quality and quantity have become attributes for that component. So same thing with salmon, it became its own component. Riparian areas came up quite a bit, and that has been defined as its own component. And then forests and forest cover, habitat, flora, fauna has been grouped under a 4th component called natural areas and open spaces. And I also just want to mention that biodiversity is sort of the overarching concept behind all of the ecological components. So together, your components are meant to incorporate all aspects aspects of biodiversity. That's why you don't see that one separate out as its own component. On the human well-being side, we had lots of comments relating to things that contribute to human health and safety: clean water, clean air, a safe environment to live in, to recreate in. Those were grouped under a concept or a component, human health and safety. We've had a number of comments related to development and the aesthetics of a community, the look of it, food, agriculture, and those concepts were grouped together under a component called livable communities. Lots of people mentioned the importance of education and knowledge and awareness, responsibility to protect, so those concepts were grouped under a component called stewardship. Recreation, of course, was a big one that came out as well. Trails, fishing, wilderness recreation facilities. So those concepts were grouped under a recreation component. And then a number of people, and the reason it looks smaller than it is, lots of people mentioned something about a link or a connection with a watershed cultural and spiritual values. And then there's about 5 or 6 other statements that I couldn't lump together because they were quite different, but they all are captured under this idea that the watershed provides spiritual and cultural values for us. And then finally, energy and power was raised, and that was grouped together with the other important resources in the watershed, gravel and water supply, under the resource industries component. So one thing that we want to get some feedback on today is, are these components the right components for our watershed plan? So that's the question that we'll be asking you on a feedback form today. They're providing the basis for our watershed plan, and they do a really good job of reflecting the feedback that we got in November, many of them as attributes of the specific components. So have a look at that and think about that as you go through the meeting today. What I'm going to show you next is what the health assessment is going to look like, and in a minute we're going to invite you to come out to the stations and look at each one individually. But I'm just going to walk you through what one looks like, and I'm going to use the Riparian Zones as an example. So at the very top you'll see the general goal statement that we've chosen for Riparian Zones. In a world with unlimited resources and capacity, we would have a very specific goal statement with a time limit on it. But what we've done right now, for the purpose of the stage that we're at, is set a very general overarching goal. And then the attributes are shown in purple. Attributes generally describe the size of the component, the condition of the component, and the context in which the component sits. So if you think about riparian forests, the size describes how much riparian forest we have. The condition describes the composition of that forest, and the context describes the connectivity of the riparian zone. And then we've got a number of indicators that tell us something about the current status of that attribute. So in the case of riparian forest, we're looking at the percentage of the zone that is intact forest, and then the maturity. So how big is it? So we've got a width and a height measurement. And then you'll see, as Abby mentioned, we have our current rating, and then we try to fit that in. Is this poor? Is this fair, good, or very good? Which requires you to think about what those categories are. And in some cases, we've been able to describe those numerically. In other cases, they're described descriptively. And so you'll see that when you go out to the stations as well. In some cases, we're data deficient, and so that, again, is a placeholder, a place where we'd like to collect future information. So when you go to the stations, again, we'll be inviting feedback on these indicators, on the attributes. We wanted to have the watershed plan developed enough so that you'd have something to look at and comment on, but not developed so far that we couldn't easily go back and change things. And so we're inviting input on it today, and you're welcome to do that through the forms that are available to you at the stations.